Halloween night had always brought a strange energy to the neighborhood. From the quiet morning to the chaotic evening of costumes and candy, there was a constant buzz in the air. This year, I'd decided to spend it alone, skipping the Halloween parties and enjoying a quiet evening with a few horror movies. The decorations outside flickered with the soft glow of orange lights, giving the street an almost ghostly feel as the night deepened. By 10 p.m., the last trick-or-treaters had come and gone, leaving the street empty. I was grateful for the stillness, the silence settling around the house like a warm blanket. With a mug of tea in hand, I nestled into my couch, letting the hum of the TV fill the room. The scenes of fictional horror were familiar, comforting in a strange way, a safe kind of fear. But as I watched, a small unease crept in, a flicker of paranoia, as if someone was watching me from just outside the window. I laughed it off, chalking it up to the spooky ambiance of Halloween and the movies. I reminded myself that the night was meant to feel this way, that Halloween was all about fear and fun. I leaned back into the couch, ready to relax and enjoy the rest of the night. The shrill ring of my phone cut through the quiet, making me jump. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. My first thought was that it was some automated call or maybe a wrong number, but something made me pick it up. Perhaps just the curiosity of the moment. I brought the phone to my ear, waiting for a voice to speak. But there was nothing, just silence. I waited, listening, my heart picking up its pace. I was about to hang up when I heard something faint, barely audible, a soft shuffling noise, almost like someone moving in the background. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the call ended with a click. I stared at my phone, unsettled. It was Halloween, after all. Someone probably thought it'd be funny to prank a random number with a creepy call. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was nothing more than a harmless joke. But a small knot of unease lingered, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I tried to settle back into the movie, but my focus had shifted, my mind lingering on that silent call. It was silly, I told myself. Just a prank, maybe even some bored kids. But as the minutes ticked by, my phone rang again. The same unknown number flashing on the screen. A part of me wanted to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. This time, I answered more cautiously, holding my breath as I waited. The silence was thicker now, somehow more unsettling. And then, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, followed by what might have been distant laughter, low and chilling. My skin prickled, a shiver running down my spine as I strained to listen, trying to make sense of the strange noises. The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone, my heart pounding. I wanted to laugh it off again, to tell myself it was all in good fun, but a nagging doubt gnawed at me. The thought that it might be more than a joke began to creep in, a dark tendril of fear that I couldn't quite shake. The calls came twice more, each time with no words, only sounds, whispers, faint breathing, sometimes what sounded like footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just Halloween jitters. After the last call, I'd almost convinced myself to turn off my phone for the night, to shut out the unsettling sounds and try to sleep. But as I sat there, a soft knock echoed from the window behind me. I froze, the sound so unexpected that it took me a moment to process it. The knock came again, this time a little louder, sending a chill through me. My mind raced, reasoning that it could be kids playing pranks, messing with houses late on Halloween. But there was something about the knock that felt wrong, too quiet, too deliberate. I held my breath, listening, and then it came again, a soft tap, tap, tap against the glass. It felt like a message, a subtle warning, and my heart began to race. I moved slowly, barely breathing, as I crept toward the window. But as I reached it, the knocking stopped, leaving a thick, unsettling silence in its place. I peered through the glass, my eyes scanning the dark yard, searching for any hint of movement. But there was nothing, just the empty street, the shadows cast by the flickering Halloween lights. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it was probably just the wind or a stray branch tapping against the window. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something or someone was outside, and I couldn't ignore the chill of dread creeping over me. As I stepped away from the window, my phone rang again, and I stared at the screen, the unknown number flashing like a silent threat. My phone rang for what felt like the 100th time that night, the unknown number flashing on the screen. But before I could even think of answering, a louder, more insistent knock came from the front door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I moved cautiously to the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the security app on my phone to check the camera feed. The screen loaded, but all I saw was darkness. The camera had been covered, someone had intentionally blocked it. I backed away, a wave of panic flooding over me. Whoever was out there wasn't playing a harmless prank. They were here for something darker, something that left me feeling more vulnerable than ever. I dialed the police, my voice shaky as I tried to explain the situation. The operator kept her voice calm, reassuring me that officers were on their way. I clutched the phone tightly, barely breathing as I waited, the silence in the house amplifying every small creak and groan. I glanced around, feeling the walls close in on me, every shadow taking on a menacing shape. The only comfort was the knowledge that help was on its way. The sound of approaching sirens was a welcome relief, breaking the eerie silence that had filled my house. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street, casting strange shadows over the quiet neighborhood. I felt a glimmer of hope as I peeked through the window, watching 2 police cars pull up to the curb. Officers quickly exited their vehicles, surveying the area before splitting up, 2 of them heading towards my front door, and the others sweeping around the perimeter of my yard. I opened the door as the officers approached, my voice trembling as I explained what had been happening. They listened intently, nodding as I recounted the strange calls, the knocks on the window, the figure who had blocked my camera. One of the officers reassured me, promising that they'd conduct a thorough search and make sure everything was safe. Another officer came up to inform us that they'd found a man nearby. He'd been lingering by the edge of my property, watching the house. They hadn't approached him yet, but he matched the description I'd given, someone lurking around with an intent that felt anything but innocent. With some officers staying to check the property, the others moved to question the man they'd found nearby. I watched from the window, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread as the police surrounded him, their flashlights revealing a face that was shadowed yet familiar in a deeply unsettling way. He didn't resist, merely standing there with an odd calm as they began their search. Finally, one of the officers returned, his expression serious as he informed me they'd found something on the man. He had photos of me, dozens of them. Some were taken during the day, others at night, all of them clearly focused on my house, my daily routine, even moments when I was unaware. He hadn't just been lurking tonight, he'd been watching for days, maybe weeks. The officers assured me that he would be taken into custody and questioned, but I couldn't shake the horror that had settled in my chest. This wasn't just a prank, it was calculated, obsessive, and terrifyingly real. The officers completed their sweep of the property, finding no signs of forced entry, no other traces of anyone lurking around. They assured me that the man would be detained and charged, that they would dig deeper into his background to determine the full extent of his intentions. After they left, I checked the locks twice, then again, trying to regain some sense of security. I lay on my bed still restless, but now that he's been arrested, I felt much safer. The haunted house had always been a cornerstone of the city's Halloween season, and each year I made a point of visiting it. Its reputation had grown over the years, drawing both locals and tourists, everyone eager to see just how far the attraction would go to scare them. This year, the anticipation was at a peak. Rumors were swirling about new, intense scenes that blurred the line between staged scares and real terror. People claimed the haunted house was more extreme, that this year's setup would test your limits in ways it hadn't before. I couldn't help but feel the thrill of excitement as I approached the building, the line already stretching around the corner despite the late hour. The place looked darker this year, with eerie lighting that gave the impression the building itself was alive, watching those brave enough to enter. I joined the line, feeling the hum of anticipation from everyone around me. People whispered about what to expect inside, some boasting about last year's scenes, while others seemed genuinely nervous, their voices hushed and tense. By the time I reached the entrance, my pulse was already racing. The door creaked open, and I was met by an actor dressed as a demented clown, his eyes locking onto mine with a chilling smile. Inside, the lights were dim, casting long shadows over the twisted decor. With each step, I felt a little thrill of fear, wondering what kind of horrors they had in store this year. As I made my way through the dark, twisting corridors, the atmosphere grew heavier. Each room was more elaborate than the last, filled with actors who threw themselves into their roles, some screaming, others silently looming with twisted smiles. I was about halfway through when I entered a dimly lit room, the air thick with the smell of something metallic, like rust or old blood. In the corner, a young woman caught my attention. She looked different from the other actors, not just scared but terrified, her face pale, hair matted, her eyes wide with a desperation I hadn't seen in any other performance. Her clothes were torn, revealing bruises and what looked like dried blood on her skin. She locked eyes with me, reaching out as if begging for help. Her lips moved, and though I couldn't hear her words, her mouth formed the words, "Help me," repeatedly. This was different from anything I'd ever seen in a haunted house. The way she looked, the way she moved, it all felt too real. I forced myself to take a step back, convincing myself it was just part of the show. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I hurried through the rest of the house, the image of her face burned into my mind, her silent pleas echoing long after I left the room. The unease followed me as I exited the haunted house, the thrill of the experience marred by that disturbing encounter. I glanced around, noticing a few other visitors who seemed equally shaken, exchanging wary glances as they left. I knew I couldn't be the only one who'd felt it, who'd seen something that didn't sit right. My mind raced with questions, wondering if what I'd seen was all just a perfectly crafted scene, or if something more sinister lurked behind the staged horrors. Determined to get answers, I approached one of the staff members near the entrance, a young woman with a cheerfully creepy smile. I asked her about the woman I'd seen, describing the bruises and the desperation in her eyes. She laughed it off, insisting it was all part of the experience, an immersive element, meant to add an edge of realism that would leave visitors questioning what was real and what wasn't. She called it a new level of horror, something that would keep people talking. But her laughter didn't ease the knot in my stomach. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen wasn't just an act. Her eyes, the terror in her expression, it felt like something more than just a well-done performance. Yet, with nothing else to go on, I left, feeling unsettled but helpless to do anything about it. That night, unable to shake the experience, I turned to social media, hoping to find others who might have noticed the same thing. Sure enough, posts had already started circulating about the haunted house. Some visitors shared their excitement, hyping up the extreme new scenes, while others hinted at feeling unnerved, describing a particular actor who had seemed more than just frightened. One post caught my attention, a user describing a woman who'd appeared bruised and injured, her performance so real that it had left them rattled. I read through the comments, a thread of similar stories emerging. People speculated wildly. Some believed it was all part of the attraction, designed to shock and horrify, while others wondered aloud if something was truly wrong. The haunted house's management seemed to have picked up on the buzz, releasing statements about their commitment to realistic horror and pushing boundaries to create a unique experience. Their response only fueled the speculation, leaning into the controversy as if it were just another part of the show. But to me, it felt wrong. I replayed my experience, the woman's desperate expression, the words, "Help me," etched into my memory. It wasn't just another scare. There was something real there, a rawness that haunted me long after I closed my laptop. Yet, with no proof and only speculation to go on, I was left with a lingering sense of dread, wondering if I'd just witnessed a masterful act or a glimpse of something far darker. Days passed, but the feeling of dread lingered. I found myself obsessively checking social media, reading posts from others who'd visited the haunted house. Each new post seemed to heighten my unease. More people reported similar experiences, seeing bruised actors, catching glimpses of fear that felt too genuine, hearing whispered pleas that stayed with them long after leaving. I couldn't help but wonder if this was just clever marketing, a psychological trick to keep visitors on edge, or if something was deeply, truly wrong. The feeling gnawed at me until I decided I couldn't just let it go. I returned to the haunted house, hoping a second look might give me some clarity. But this time, the experience felt even darker. The actors seemed more intense, the scenes more extreme, and the air thickened with a tension that was hard to shake. As I moved through the house, every shadow felt alive, every scream too raw, like the entire place was teetering on the edge of some unseen nightmare. I passed by the room where I'd seen the woman before, but this time it was empty. The silence felt heavier there, as if something had been stripped away. I could feel my heart pounding as I moved on, each step slower than the last, feeling the weight of something unspoken lurking within those walls. I left that night more shaken than ever, but without answers, only a stronger feeling that something was terribly wrong. A few days later, I was jolted awake by the sound of a news alert on my phone. Groggy, I glanced at the screen, my pulse quickening as I read the headline, "Popular haunted house under investigation amid allegations of abuse." My hands went cold as I sat up, reading every word with growing horror. The article detailed how multiple complaints had led police to inspect the haunted house. Visitors, accounts of actors displaying signs of real injury, had triggered a full investigation, with law enforcement probing deeper into the practices behind the attraction. It turned out that I hadn't been alone in my suspicions. More and more people had come forward, their experiences strikingly similar to mine. The police hadn't released much information, but they confirmed that certain employees were under investigation for potential misconduct. Rumors spread like wildfire, with some claiming that actors had been coerced into performing against their will, unable to break character even if they wanted to. The haunted house's management remained silent, and that silence felt damning. My mind spun with questions and doubts, remembering the desperation in that woman's eyes. I had brushed off her fear as a part of the show, convinced myself it was all just an act. But now, as I stared at the screen, I realized that my worst fears were beginning to come true. The truth unraveled quickly after that. Over the following days, details emerged that made my skin crawl. Reports confirmed that several actors hadn't been acting at all. They had been real victims, trapped in the attraction and forced to portray scenes of horror for visitors. The haunted house had been a front for illegal activities, with certain individuals in the management team orchestrating the entire operation. Social media exploded, flooded with outrage and horror as the story gained traction. News stations covered the story in excruciating detail, revealing how the so-called haunted house had been used to exploit people, to turn real suffering into a twisted form of entertainment. Police arrested 4 people tied to the attraction's operations, the charges ranging from abuse to unlawful confinement, with the investigation ongoing. I was horrified, realizing that I had been a part of their twisted game. I'd paid for a ticket, entered their dark corridors, and walked right past real victims, mistaking their terror for a performance. The memory of that woman came flooding back, her bruised face and desperate eyes haunting me, a reminder of the suffering I'd unknowingly witnessed. Halloween night had always been our favorite time of the year. It was the one night we could be out late, dressed in costumes, and feel a mix of excitement and fear that only seemed to exist in the crisp October air. The streets were alive with kids in costumes, porch lights casting an orange glow as we darted from house to house, our candy bags growing heavier with every stop. As we wandered further into the neighborhood, the houses grew darker, fewer families handing out treats. We laughed, telling stories about the creepiest houses and daring each other to knock on doors that looked abandoned or haunted. That's when one of us brought up Mr. Jenkins, a reclusive man who lived alone, his house always quiet, his windows always dark. Rumor had it that he'd never handed out candy, that he barely left his house, and that kids who dared to knock on his door often ran away before he could answer. But tonight, feeling a surge of courage and thrill, we decided that Mr. Jenkins' house would be our ultimate stop. We nudged each other with nervous smiles as we approached his front door, our footsteps sounding loud in the quiet of his yard. Mr. Jenkins' house was as eerie as we'd imagined. The porch light was off, and the whole place seemed swallowed up in shadows. We exchanged glances, our breaths coming quicker, each of us too proud to back down. With a shaky hand, one of us reached up and knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the still night. We waited, hearts pounding, but the door stayed closed. We knocked again, a little louder this time, laughing nervously as we waited. But the silence was thick, and we began to wonder if he was even home. The idea of leaving started to feel appealing, the thrill wearing off as our nerves grew. We turned, ready to head back down the steps when, out of nowhere, the door creaked open behind us. Mr. Jenkins stood there, his face shadowed and unreadable. His eyes swept over us, lingering just a little too long, and a chill ran down my spine. Before any of us could say anything, he reached out, his hand gripping the arm of one of our friends, and with a swift, terrifying motion, he pulled them inside, slamming the door shut behind him. For a second, none of us could move. We stared at the closed door, our minds struggling to process what had just happened. The stillness broke as we started pounding on the door, calling our friend's name, begging Mr. Jenkins to let them go. Our voices grew frantic, a rising panic filling the air, but there was no answer, only the heavy silence of the house looming over us. Fear tightened around us like a grip, and our minds raced. We tried the doorknob, but it was locked. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, giving us no glimpse of what was happening inside. The thought of abandoning our friend felt unthinkable. Yet terror kept us rooted in place, our pounding and shouting growing weaker as reality set in. The idea of going for help crossed our minds, but the fear of leaving was almost paralyzing. Yet, as we stood there in the dark, we realized we had no other choice. Our friend was inside, alone with a man who had already proven unpredictable. Finally, we turned, running back to the street, our footsteps pounding against the pavement as we looked for any sign of help. When we reached a safe distance, we stopped, panting, glancing back at the house that had swallowed our friend. Guilt and terror twisted inside us. We couldn't leave. We knew we had to do something, even if our hearts were still racing with fear. One of us volunteered to stay near the front door, hiding in the shadows, hoping to catch any sign of movement. Another crept around the back, hoping there might be a way to see or hear what was happening inside. As for me, I ran down the street looking for an adult or anyone with a phone who could call the police. A few houses down, I spotted a porch light and rushed over, my breath hitching as I frantically explained what had happened. The neighbor listened, her face growing serious as she took out her phone and dialed 911. I listened to her relay our story, her voice calm but urgent, and heard her reassure the operator that we'd wait nearby until the police arrived. I returned to the others, my heart pounding as we watched the house from a distance, waiting for help to arrive. Each second felt like an eternity, the night around us growing colder, the silence only broken by our nervous breaths. We knew that once the police came, we'd have to explain everything, but in that moment, all we could do was wait, hoping that our friend was safe inside that dark, silent house. We didn't have to wait long before the flashing lights of a police car turned the corner, washing the street in red and blue. Relief flooded through us as two officers stepped out of the car, their expressions serious as they took in our frantic faces. We hurried to explain what had happened, pointing to Mr. Jenkins' house, describing how he'd pulled our friend inside without a word. The officers nodded, asking us a few questions before reassuring us that they'd handle the situation. They instructed us to stay back as they made their way up the path to Mr. Jenkins' front door. We watched, tense and silent, our eyes glued to the door as the officers knocked, the sound echoing in the chilly Halloween night. For a moment, nothing happened. The house stayed dark and quiet, just as it had when we'd first arrived. But then, slowly, the door creaked open. Mr. Jenkins stood in the doorway, his face calm, almost bored, as he looked at the officers with a faint smile. One officer began speaking to Mr. Jenkins, his tone firm, explaining that there had been reports of a possible abduction and asking to see the friend who had been pulled inside. Mr. Jenkins glanced over his shoulder, then back at the officers, shrugging casually. He waved his hand dismissively, laughing softly as he explained that it had all been a misunderstanding, a harmless Halloween joke. We could barely breathe as he continued, describing how he'd intended to give us a scare, to add some excitement to our night. He even chuckled, as if expecting the officers to join in his laughter. But the officers remained serious, unimpressed, their expressions hardening as they reminded him that his actions had frightened us and gone too far. Our friend finally emerged, looking shaken but unharmed. They walked out slowly, avoiding eye contact, the discomfort and embarrassment written all over their face. We wanted to rush to their side, to make sure they were okay, but something about the whole situation held us back, a deep unease that settled in the pit of our stomachs. Mr. Jenkins leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, as he watched the officers speak to us. He maintained that it had been a simple Halloween prank, an attempt to join in the spirit of the holiday. His tone was calm, almost mocking, and he seemed unfazed by the police presence, as though he truly believed his actions were nothing more than harmless fun. The officers, however, weren't so easily convinced. They gave him a stern warning, explaining that his idea of a joke had crossed a line, that he'd terrified us and put our friend in a dangerous situation. Mr. Jenkins only shrugged, nodding with an expression that barely concealed his amusement. The officers exchanged glances, but ultimately they let him go with a final warning, instructing him to avoid any further pranks. We felt a wave of relief, mixed with lingering unease, as the officers turned back to us, offering a few reassuring words before escorting us a safe distance from the house. Our friend rejoined us, still shaken, avoiding our eyes as we walked away from Mr. Jenkins' yard. As we walked home together, the tension slowly began to fade, replaced by a strange mix of embarrassment and relief. Our friend explained in a hushed voice how Mr. Jenkins had dragged them inside, leaving them alone in a dark room before coming back and telling them it was all just a joke. The way he had looked at them, the strange amusement in his eyes, made our friend shiver, even as they recounted it. We laughed a little, trying to brush off the fear, but we knew we'd never forget that night. Halloween had always been a night for harmless scares, for costumes and candy, but this was different. This was real. And as we glanced back at Mr. Jenkins' house, still dark and quiet, we felt a chill run through us, a reminder of how close we had come to something far worse. We vowed never to go near that house again, to keep our distance from the man who had turned our Halloween into a nightmare.